Thank you very much. Again, I want to thank Vestalina and Riverside County and the SBA for the opportunity today. A little bit about myself. My name is David Harlow. I'm the president and CEO of ITC-Diligence. We're licensed customs brokers nationally, and we're also national foreign trade zone consultants. So we work closely with businesses in regions and government entities to help to promote and give access to companies with the Foreign Trade Zone program. So we work with businesses to help them understand the value of the program for financial and logistical benefits, and then how to navigate through that application process and compliance and training process, as well as an ongoing basis. So it's something we have been working closely here with the grantees in the Inland Empire, which is March JPA, City of Palm Springs, as well as the ports of LA and Long Beach are also grantees for the program. There's easily close to 15 grantees just in California alone, which is the largest in the country. But today we're going to talk about the Foreign Trade Zone. This is a federal program. It's one of many federal programs that's offered by the federal government, but this is unique in that it's specific to importing and exporting. It helps companies that are manufacturing to realize financial and logistical benefits for manufacturing as well as distribution of finished goods. Probably the best way to describe the Foreign Trade Zone, it's like a bonded warehouse on steroids. A lot of you may be familiar with the bonded warehouse, in that it's another federal program that is within the port limits, that has minimal benefits in that you can do very little in a bonded warehouse other than just mainly storing and some small manipulation. There's a lot more government oversight with bonded warehouses. The Foreign Trade Zone essentially takes almost all of the benefits of a bonded warehouse, puts it into one foreign trade zone instead of 9 different bonded warehouses. A foreign trade zone can be anywhere your business is today. There is no limitation as to where your business has to be to benefit from this program. In addition, in a foreign trade zone, I can have domestic goods and foreign goods located in the same warehouse. I can manipulate, commingle them, manufacture all of them together. I don't need to separate my domestic goods from my foreign goods. I have an inventory control system that manages that for me. So Customs gives you a lot more latitude, a lot more ability to manage your business and be successful with the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program. So again, we can manufacture, destroy, manipulate, or store goods in a foreign trade zone with domestic and foreign goods. The Foreign Trade Zone program was not intended to be at the ports of LA and Long Beach or at the different seaports around the country. The Foreign Trade Zone program was meant to assist with the distribution of goods throughout the United States, globally and nationally. So as you can see here, you see a lot of foreign trade zones that fall along the Alameda corridor as well as the NAFTA corridor. Again, keep in mind, 40% of the goods that come into the United States come into LA and Long Beach. 80% of those goods do not stay in LA and Long Beach. They're moving north, south, and east of Los Angeles. So you're going to see a lot of movement of goods, and the Foreign Trade Zone helps facilitate that movement by allowing your manufacturing facility or distribution facility to be in those distribution lanes going across the country. FTZ 50 is the Port of Long Beach, and FTZ 202 we see here is the Port of Los Angeles. The Foreign Trade Zone program has actually been around for quite a while. It was developed back in 1934 by the Department of Commerce. It was signed into law by President Roosevelt and to help combat the Great Depression that we were experiencing back then. So this was part of the New Deal to help bring jobs back to the United States and create more jobs. The basis of the program was to create and retain jobs, stimulate the economy, and promote international trade. So while that's important today, it's even more important. While that was important back in 1934, it's more important today because in 1934 it was a U.S. economy. Today it's a global economy. So these are not goods that are staying in the United States. These are goods where raw materials are coming in, using a foreign trade zone to export those goods through a manufacturing process. Or it's bringing finished goods into the United States to see financial benefits to enter into the commerce here in the United States. What are the different types of industries that benefit from the foreign trade zone? As you see here, I've listed the top 10 industries. These are the industries that are either heavily regulated by the U.S. government, have high tariff rates with the U.S. government, or are high value goods. So typically electronics has a duty rate of sometimes 1% to 2%, but if I throw it into a $500,000 container at 2%, now all of a sudden I've got some high duty. Alcohol, heavily taxed and high duty rates. Apparel and textiles has high duty rates. Aerospace industry, high value. Automobiles, high value. So again, these are the industries that see the greatest benefit in the foreign trade zone because of those circumstances. But understand that every industry can benefit from the foreign trade zone, as long as one thing happens. Once you import something, whether that's a raw material, component, or finished good, you're now eligible for the foreign trade zone program. So to give you a good example, if I bring in toys, which by the way, toys aren't manufactured in the US anymore. Toys are also duty-free and toys are also very inexpensive. But toys are also used in foreign trade zones. The most common example would be if I import toys into the United States that are intended for Mexico or Canada. Those toys were made to meet the standards of Mexico and Canada. But if I bring them into the United States, I now must adhere to those US requirements, even though the toys are going to move to Mexico and Canada. So in the toy industry, a lot of companies will use the foreign trade zone so they don't have to endure any US regulations for goods that are not intended for the US. So they come into a foreign trade zone without being examined. They're now able to move in bond directly into Mexico or Canada, where it does meet those requirements for those countries. So it creates an incentive for the toy industry to be able to manage their supply chain better and minimize their costs in that supply chain process. So that's just another example of companies using the foreign trade zone in different industries. So there's two different types of foreign trade zones. The most commonly used one is the general purpose zone, because this is a foreign trade zone that has certain limitations in that there's no retail allowed, which means a consumer cannot walk into a foreign trade zone and purchase something in a foreign trade zone. They must clear the goods first, and then it can be delivered to a consumer or a retailer. So there's no retail allowed. The other advantage is this is typically for small businesses and medium-sized businesses that can utilize third-party logistics companies that are foreign trade zones. They can also be located in industrial parks. They can be located in a lot of former government bases like March and like Georgia Air Force Base have a high investment of foreign trade zone. So there's a lot more flexibility in a general purpose zone. But there is one limitation, and that limitation is 60 miles or 90 minutes from the port of entry. So for example, here in the Inland Empire, they count that 60 miles or 90 minutes from the Port of Los Angeles. So there you get limited access to this part of the program because of that mileage. But an example of thinking outside the box and using your creativity is really promoted in the Foreign Trade Zone program. So as an example, there's a company we all should be familiar with called IKEA that has a distribution center up in Tejon Ranch, just outside of Bakersfield. They wanted to be a foreign trade zone. They could save a lot of money being a foreign trade zone. So what they did is they looked at the general purpose concept and said 60 miles or 90 minutes. Well, you and I can't get there in 60 miles, and you and I can't get there in 90 minutes, right? But again, the law is vague in a lot of places that promotes creativity for business. The law doesn't say how fast you go. It doesn't say when you drive. So the Port of LA got in their car at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday night, probably going 90 miles an hour, and justified to the Foreign Trade Zone Board in Washington, D.C., that they got to Tejon Ranch in 90 minutes. They had been a foreign trade zone for almost 10 years now. Wow. They're seeing significant benefits that's allowed them to grow their distribution business in Tejon Ranch. It's created jobs, and it's guaranteed the jobs stay. So this is, again, the private industry being creative, thinking outside the box, using that ingenuity that we all have to make this program work for us. And I'll show you more examples of how that creativity works throughout the program. The other type of part of the program is what's called a subzone. A subzone is typically for manufacturers. Although you can manufacture in a general purpose zone, you see the much large scale manufacturers use a subzone. But one of the benefits of the subzone is that you do not have to be within 60 miles or 90 minutes. So I can be in the middle of nowhere. I can still have access to the foreign trade zone and still be able to benefit from the program with all the benefits that are allowed. Okay? One of the limitations of the subzone that used to be a limitation was that it was single user only, meaning private importers could only be a subzone. That's recently changed, so now even a 3PL can be a subzone if it makes sense for them. So again, it just gives more options of flexibility for all different types of business models. Most of the more common foreign trade zones you'll see are going to be automobile manufacturers, some high-level electronics companies, oil refineries are all subzones here in the United States. So how is the program managed? And this is probably the most important part about this program that makes it unique to other programs similar to it all over the world. In Mexico, you have maquiladora programs. In Asia, you have free trade zones. In Europe and Canada, you have bonded warehouse programs. They all have one requirement. You can benefit from those programs in different ways, but at the end of the day, you have to export the goods. Okay? In the United States, you still have the option to export, but you also can import and enter the commerce. And so those benefits can be passed through to consumers in the U.S. It doesn't force an export only. So what's unique about that is that in the Foreign Trade Zone Board, it's developed by 3 entities, or managed by 3 entities. The Department of Commerce, the Department of Treasury, and the Department of Homeland Security. So why is that so important? Because I didn't mention U.S. Customs. U.S. Customs doesn't manage the program. They don't interpret the program. They're tasked with only one thing, and that's to enforce the program. Imagine if I told all of you today, moving forward, we're going to cut your revenue for your business in half, and we're going to double your cost of doing business. This is what the Foreign Trade Zone Board has tasked U.S. Customs with. Customs loses duty, which is their revenue, and they have to staff and enforce a program that requires more man-hours and more investment. So it's important that U.S. Customs doesn't get to interpret or manage the program. Because if U.S. Customs did, more than likely, you wouldn't see some of the benefits this program offers. So U.S. Customs enforces the program. The Foreign Trade Zone Board in Washington, D.C. manages the program. But in Washington, D.C., we can't expect them to understand what's happening in every corner of the United States. So they actually issue grants of authority to local entities to manage their local regions. So this is usually a nonprofit or a public utility. So for example, here in Riverside County, March JPA is a nonprofit association that manages the western Riverside County for the Foreign Trade Zone program. On the east side of the county is the city of Palm Springs. So you have foreign trade zones all over the country, with 15 here, of course, in California. But again, we can't expect every grantee to understand what happens in your warehouse every day and make sure you're doing everything correctly. So what the grantee does is issues an operator's agreement to that warehouse, to that manufacturer, that requires that they adhere to certain requirements and laws regarding the program. And so that's where you'll see the general purpose zone operator or the subzone operator. Okay? So that's the history, the infrastructure. Where was the program about 30 years ago? Where is it today? Back in 1970, there was 10 foreign trade zones throughout the United States. There's now easily well over 250 zones around the United States. There's over 2,700 firms have been created or utilized the foreign trade zone. There's now over 500,000 jobs created in the foreign trade zones today. Still, 64% of the goods in a foreign trade zone are domestic goods, whether that's a raw material, component, or finished goods. So this isn't a program to displace U.S. jobs. This isn't a program to replace U.S. industry. This is a program to bring jobs back to the U.S. industry and to use domestic goods or domestic raw materials and components produced here to manufacture them with some foreign source products to make a finished product that can be sold all over the world. In addition to that, there's now over $500 billion that come into the United States go into foreign trade zones. So this is no longer a small program like it was 30 years ago. This is an extremely large program that continues to exponentially grow nearly every year. And then lastly, on the export side, there's now over $50 billion that export out of foreign trade zones every year, and that number continues to grow as well. So now we've talked about the program. Now let's really get to the meat of things. What can I do in a foreign trade zone? Literally everything you're doing in your warehouse today can be done in a foreign trade zone. Whether that's repackaging, storing, manipulation, inspecting, testing, cleaning, fixing, you name it, destroy it, manufacture it, assemble it, take components that come from other countries and components that come from NAFTA countries, turn it into a finished product that qualifies for NAFTA. Now I can export it to Mexico with no duty. So it allows all of these different things to happen in a foreign trade zone. Why does that happen? Because a foreign trade zone is outside the commerce of the U.S. So just like if you were to have an embassy, whatever happens on that embassy doesn't technically happen in the United States. It happens that embassy representing that country. Same thing in a foreign trade zone. When goods are in a foreign trade zone, they have not entered the U.S. commerce. They do not have to adhere to U.S. Customs requirements as if it did enter the commerce. So partner agencies like FDA, EPA, DOT do not have to be adhered to in a foreign trade zone. The one great thing is alcohol. Alcohol has to adhere to ABC requirements. In a foreign trade zone, they don't. So there's a lot of benefits for importers of tequila and other liquors to use a foreign trade zone to minimize their costs, and we'll show you some of those savings without having to go through the hurdles of some of these government agencies. So it's definitely a benefit. But like I said before, literally anything you can do in a foreign trade zone can be, in your warehouse now, can be done in a foreign trade zone. Even firearms, even some pharmaceuticals come into foreign trade zones as well. So let me give you some examples and really help you be creative and think outside the box. These are Lamborghinis that were imported from Italy. They came straight into a foreign trade zone. The importer did not post a bond, did not file an entry, paid absolutely no customs fees at all to bring it into a foreign trade zone. In the meantime, they added roll bars, removed the passenger seat. They did not adhere to any government agencies. While it's sitting in the foreign trade zone, the decision was made that we actually want these cars to participate in a race. So under the foreign trade zone, I can temporarily take them out of a foreign trade zone, have them participate in that race, and return them within 120 days without adhering to any government agency requirements, without paying any money to the U.S. government. This gives me that flexibility. And so at the end of the day, the Lamborghinis were sent back to Italy with no costs incurred by the importer. So the question always is, well, one of those cars, I'm sure, hit the wall and it was destroyed into 100 different pieces. So what does Customs look at it then? Customs says, okay, return all 100 pieces back to the foreign trade zone. There is no penalty. There is no additional requirements. So again, that flexibility that you have in a foreign trade zone can be as creative as you want it to be, or you can be. This is liquor. A lot of times when liquor is transported, a portion of that liquor is damaged in transport, just from the shaking and the moving around of the vehicles or the airplane and so forth. Well, in a foreign trade zone, I can fix and repair anything. Well, the problem with alcohol is you can't fix or repair a broken bottle of alcohol. So in a foreign trade zone, I bring that truck of liquor into a foreign trade zone. I determine 2% of that liquor was destroyed. I report to Customs that 2% is destroyed. I pay no duties, I pay no taxes on what I don't deliver and on what I don't sell to my customers. So I have that advantage of being able to, something that I cannot sell to my customer, I do not pay duties or taxes on. Here's an example of cigarettes. These cigarettes were brought straight into a foreign trade zone. By doing that, they realized that there was no Surgeon General warning on the cigarettes. They applied the labeling to meet the compliance requirements of customs, and now they could enter the commerce and be sold at a retail store. So what would happen if this wasn't a foreign trade zone? U.S. Customs would have seized the cigarettes, destroyed the cigarettes, and penalized the importer, but more importantly, also targeted that importer for future shipments. So the foreign trade zone really saved their neck here in that they were able to manage their compliance more effectively than if they didn't use a foreign trade zone. Also keep in mind, we talked about bonded warehouses in the beginning. Bonded warehouses are in the commerce of the U.S., so they have to adhere to all those government agency requirements. If cigarettes came into a bonded warehouse without the Surgeon General warning, they can be held as a non-compliance issue for the importer. The foreign trade zone is the only vehicle that gives you that opportunity to fix or change things before entering the commerce. These are electrical components that did not have an English owner's manual, which is a requirement by U.S. Customs. So in a foreign trade zone, they can add this English owner's manual so that they meet the compliance requirements and then deliver it to the retail store. And again, more and more examples. These are wheel rims that didn't have the country of origin marking. They applied the country of origin marking in the foreign trade zone environment as well to avoid any compliance issues. And so again, literally any commodity you can think of, you have this flexibility. Whether it's raw materials, components, whether it's damaged goods, goods that don't meet quality control requirements, goods like in the top left-hand corner, this is construction equipment that came into the United States. The engine did not conform to U.S. requirements, so they brought it to a foreign trade zone, removed the engine, put a U.S. engine in its place, cleared customs, and met the timeline to the construction site. The engine that came from Japan was actually exported back to Japan. So again, they avoided any penalties or fees by U.S. Customs to see the project go through. And then probably my best or my favorite example is the bottom right-hand corner. This is satellite equipment. There's a satellite manufacturer up in San Francisco that uses the foreign trade zone. So they import nuts and bolts and wiring and technology for this satellite from all over the world, 20 different countries, and they're paying duty in almost every situation. They bring it into their foreign trade zone where they manufacture it into a satellite using domestic components as well as foreign source components. They finished making it into a satellite, they tested the satellite, and then they moved the satellite to another foreign trade zone. The foreign trade zone they moved it to, we call Cape Canaveral. And what do we do at Cape Canaveral? We send satellites into space. Well, the law dictates that if you export something, you eliminate that duty. It doesn't say you have to export it to another country. So the satellite manufacturer exported it to space. They eliminated millions of dollars in duty that were applied to the satellite, which they did not have to pay U.S. Customs. Now the question, of course, is, what if that satellite comes back? And as long as it doesn't hit my backyard, I'm fine. But most satellites do burn up in the atmosphere, so that isn't really an issue, and that hasn't become an issue yet. So again, this is a company that really got creative and looked at the regulation, looked at the law to see how can I maximize my benefits through the program. So this isn't a program that's one size fits all. This is a program that really molds to your business model to help you maximize those benefits.
I have a question.
Yes?
For something like that, or even something else that you would use some parts from another country and some parts from the U.S., do you still put the made in the U.S., or do you put both made in the U.S. and made in the other country? How does that work?
So it really comes down to the value that's been placed into the product from whichever that country is. So for example, the regular standard is 51% of the value has to be made in the U.S., has to be U.S. components, which includes labor, to determine what that country of origin should be. So that would be an assessment you have to make is, do I have enough value going into this finished good to call it made in the U.S.? If I only put a little bit in, then it may still be called made in Japan or made in China. Yes?
That's such a great question. Now, there's direct and there's indirect. marketing and packaging and things of that sort, that 51% could make a big difference in marketing your product in North America. So can you just expand just a little bit more on what that might cover?
Yeah, so it typically covers the production of the product, not the packaging of the product, not the marketing, but it does include the technology, the molding, the labor that goes into it, the research and development. All that is part of that value, and it's assessing how much of that is represented on a per unit level to make that determination. And then there's a process you go through with U.S. Customs to meet those standards. Some commodities have higher or lower standards to be called made in the U.S. Some have more unique ways of making that determination. So it's definitely something that I would recommend that you work with your customs attorney on, and also work directly with U.S. Customs. And instead of just getting a verbal okay from customs, it's something you want in writing. Because if it were to come out that that officer told you yes, and it wasn't a yes, the customs officer doesn't get in trouble. You get in trouble with all the financial implications that go along with that. So it is definitely something that you want to look at very carefully on what you're doing. Maybe a good example would be if we have a company that makes sriracha. 99% of all their ingredients are made in the U.S. They bring garlic from overseas. They add the garlic to realize the huge FTZ benefit. It's still made in the U.S. because 99% of that product, those ingredients do come from the U.S. It's just the garlic doesn't. So that's an example where made in the U.S. works in an FTZ environment. Yes?
What percentage would you consider if you were to do research, development, and testing only of that 51%?
So that's really, it's not something I can give you a simple answer to. It's something we really want to understand what that commodity is, what customs interpretation of what the standard is for that commodity, and then also work with that customs attorney and with U.S. Customs, because it can change depending on your process of manufacturing, what components are and are not as well. So a good example is wearing apparel. Wearing apparel can come in pieces, but if that initial fabric is cut that looks like a shirt, but it has no pockets, it has no backing, it has no trim, Customs still calls it a shirt, and that country of origin has a much higher standard in that case. So it's definitely something that we could, work with you on and help identify what that standard is for your commodity, but there's just not a broad answer to it, and I wouldn't want to mislead you. Yes?
So you were saying that U.S. Customs can put it in writing for us? Is that a free service that they'll do for us?
Yes, so U.S. Customs has a binding ruling process that you would want to initiate, and it's going through that binding ruling process to determine your country of origin and to determine your classification. And then again, I would have to find out if there's any more processes to it to make that determination with U.S. Customs. I know that Customs doesn't typically charge for that. That's just part of their service, yes.
I just kind of, it's kind of cool because I worked in New York too. They have something called specific transformation.
Yes.
And it's a word you oftentimes use in customs. So you could bring a product into North America. Maybe you want to expand on that a little bit in the foreign trade zone, and you can change the character of the product so duties can go down.
Yeah, and so we'll get into that. I have a slide that talks about the manufacturing benefit. It's not so much about a country of origin in that case, but a manufacturing benefit. Is how do I reduce that duty by manufacturing? And manufacturing has significant benefits in the foreign trade zone that we'll get into regarding the components of raw material duties versus the finished good duty. Okay? So again, back to the slide. This is literally your supply chain can directly and indirectly benefit from this program. So how does a customs broker benefit from it? Well, again, if you're that manufacturer and you're saving money that's allowing you to expand your business or grow your business, guess what? You're sending more shipments to your broker to process those entries. That's how a broker indirectly benefits. Steamship lines, freight forwarders indirectly benefit from the program because you benefit from the program. Exporters and importers see the most direct benefit as well as manufacturers. So literally everyone in your supply chain is going to see a direct or indirect benefit in the program. Again, but so far we've only talked about reactive benefits. The reason why companies become foreign trade zones is those proactive benefits, is those financial advantages. We're going to talk about cash flow benefits as far as duty deferral. We're going to talk about duty reduction, which is manufacturing, duty elimination, which is exports. There's other benefits such as avoiding drawback, expediting drawback in some cases, as well as looking at certain taxes that can be deferred or eliminated through the Foreign Trade Zone program as well. So duty deferral. Duty deferral used to be one of those things that was always considered icing on the cake in foreign trade zones, because at the end of the day, you're not paying that money up front, but you're paying it at the end of the day when you go to deliver the goods. So duty deferral means I bring it in, instead of filing entry and paying those duties up front, while it sits in my warehouse, building my inventory or waiting for the customer to want it, I can now defer that duty on the front end. I don't pay U.S. Customs any duty until it's ready to go out of my warehouse and deliver to my client in the U.S. That's the only time I pay the duty. So that those goods sit in your warehouse for 30, 60, 90 days, that's that time frame that you're not paying those fees. You're not paying those duties. So it allows you to use that money elsewhere to, pay your employees, improve your marketing, expand your sales, and so forth. And then you only pay that when your customer's paying you. A lot of companies have mastered the idea of, okay, when I'm ready to pay my duties, I've got a 10-day term with U.S. Customs to pay my duties, but I got a COD term with my client to pay for the goods that I'm sold them. So I actually get paid by my client before I actually pay U.S. Customs. So that creates a real benefit, especially for small to medium-sized businesses. But this is even more important now, especially in the environment we're in, with the increased Chinese tariffs, with other duties around the world, especially in China, because those duty rates are going 25% more than what the previous duty was. Companies are going from a 4% duty to a 30% duty. And so the cash flow here becomes even more important now because of that increase. Even if that Chinese tariff one day were to go away, there's still that 4.6% duty deferral, which isn't significant, but it's still icing on the cake. Okay, but let's talk about how we eliminate those Chinese tariffs, because there is an option for that as well. So this is an example of a company that actually saves $18,000 a year just simply because they're a foreign trade zone. They do nothing different, and there's an $18,000 savings per year. Duty reduction, this is the manufacturing model. So this is where I bring parts of an automobile into a foreign trade zone. They have a duty rate of 5%, but I manufacture those parts into a finished product, which is an automobile. An automobile has a duty rate of 2.5%. So I've reduced 50% of my duty simply by manufacturing in a foreign trade zone. And that's the example of an automobile. There's other products out there where the parts have 5 to 10% duty, and the finished good is duty free. So it really depends on your business model and what you're manufacturing. But the idea behind this is that you get to minimize that duty through manufacturing. And any scrap that you generate or any product that's evaporated during that manufacturing process, that duty gets eliminated on that scrap process. You don't pay any duty on scrap. You don't pay any duty on any remnants of your manufacturing process. So, and keep in mind, what you're paying duty on that finished product is only the duty on the foreign value of that automobile. So if I bring parts in at $5 and the finished vehicle costs $100, I'm only paying my 2.5% on the $5. I don't pay my 2.5% on the entire vehicle, because the entire value of the vehicle wasn't foreign. Only a portion of it was, okay? But like we've heard the term before, you can have your cake and eat it too. Well, in a foreign trade zone, you get to do that. In a foreign trade zone, you get to identify different duty rates on different parts that you bring into a foreign trade zone. So if my finished product after I manufacture it is 5.5%, but I have parts that have duty rates that are less than 5.5%, and I have parts that have duty rates that are above 5.5%. So what the Foreign Trade Zone and U.S. Customs says, okay, pay the duty rates that are higher than the finished good, only pay the finished good duty rate. So if I have a duty rate of 8% and my finished good is now 5.5%, I only pay 5.5% on those parts. If I have a product that has a duty rate that's 4.3% like the frames, I only pay the 4.3%. I don't have to go up and pay the 5.5%. All of this is managed through your inventory control system to manage what those values are and what those duty rates are. So you're only seeing the benefit of the program. There is no negative to the program of causing you to pay more money because of the manufacturing process. And then lastly is duty elimination. So this is the export. So everything we talked about with duty deferral, you have that benefit. You have all the reactive benefits for manipulation. You have the manufacturing benefits. And then now if a portion of your business is exporting to other countries, you now have a duty elimination benefit. This is where I bring those goods, I manufacture those goods in the U.S. And then when I export it, whatever duty I thought I was going to pay, because I export it from a foreign trade zone, that duty is eliminated. So if I manufacture that car, that 2.5% duty, I send one car to the U.S., I pay the 2.5%. I send another car to Mexico, I pay 0 duty. So again, the export is the greatest benefit. And now throw in the Chinese tariff increases. So I went from 4% to 30%. Well, if I export that good, that 30% goes away because I've exported. I eliminate 30%. We're seeing more and more companies using foreign trade zones now because 90% of their business is delivering to the U.S. commerce and 10% is delivering outside the U.S. commerce. The savings on that 10% more than pays for the investment of the program and creates huge savings for them. We're dealing with one company right now that without the Chinese tariff, it was a $50,000 savings, which is still really good. With the Chinese tariff, it's a $500,000 savings. So especially in this environment, foreign trade zones are a really good solution for companies that manufacture or import of any kind to be able to see these benefits, and especially if you export. So this is actually a company here in the Inland Empire that imports auto parts from China. The parts are not destined for the U.S. market. They're the distribution center that services all of South America for this automobile company. So they import all these parts, they pay all the duty on all these parts, and then they export them to South America. They never filed drawback, they never did their due diligence. Now that we've helped them become a foreign trade zone, they're seeing a $768,000 savings because they're not paying those duties anymore. And they're not having to go through a drawback process either. And then of course we always come back to alcohol. With alcohol and tobacco are the only two commodities that have a tax assessed on the commodity by the federal government. That tax can be up to 80%. So you take a product like tequila, which is a hard liquor, that has a tax of 80%. So that means 80% of the value of that tequila, I have to pay that tax to the U.S. government. But if I bring it in a foreign trade zone, I can defer that tax. If I export that tequila to Asia, then I eliminate that tax. So the benefit in the foreign trade zone, just as duty is, with tax and with these two commodities, they see the same benefits. And so there's other financial benefits that's just icing on the cake. Harbor maintenance fees are fees that you pay to U.S. Customs to help support the maintenance of the terminals, the seaports. And so this is a fee that can be deferred on a quarterly basis in a foreign trade zone. So if you're a company like General Electric that's in the City of Industry, they do an average of 140 containers a day. They're paying, the average value per container is $100,000. They're paying 0.125% times 140 times 365. They now can do that once a quarter instead of on a per shipment basis. So there's, in that environment, there's a huge savings for them here, of course. But for most of us, this is something that's icing on the cake that does push it down the road, so that it's usually a much smaller cost depending on your volume and your business model. But in 2000, President Clinton signed into law the weekly entry program. So to give you some background, U.S. Customs has what they call a merchandise processing fee. It's essentially an administrative fee. So to bring something into the United States, Customs charges you a fee to do that. That doesn't include the duty or the harbor maintenance fees or any other taxes. This is just an administration fee that is 0.3464%. It has a cap of $485. So essentially, if I bring in about $150,000 or $160,000 worth of goods, I pay the cap of $485. Well, if I do 500 shipments a year, that means I'm paying $485 500 times a year. Well, under the Foreign Trade Zone program, I can reduce that by filing a weekly entry, which means I only pay that import fee once a week instead of on a per shipment basis. So how does this work without the Foreign Trade Zone? So this, again, we don't have a Foreign Trade Zone. The goods are coming from the foreign supplier. They come to the ports of LA and Long Beach. You file your entry with your broker to file that customs clearance. You then move the goods to your distribution facility, which is your warehouse. And then eventually, you're going to deliver the goods to your clients and enter the commerce in that retail market. If I'm doing 25 shipments a week, that means I'm filing 25 entries a week. That means I'm paying 25 merchandise processing fees a week. So that's about a $12,000 cost per week without the Foreign Trade Zone. Now, what does it look like with the Foreign Trade Zone? So with the Foreign Trade Zone, it still comes from my foreign supplier. It comes to the ports of LA and Long Beach, but instead of clearing customs, I'm filing a customs form to move it into my Foreign Trade Zone, which happens to be your warehouse, wherever that may be. I then, of course, withdraw the goods and deliver them to my client. So those same 25 shipments a week still happen. I now file one entry a week instead of 25. So I save on broker fees there. And then I also only pay U.S. Customs a merchandise processing fee of $485 a week. So that's an $11,000 savings a week, or a $605,000 savings a year. So as you can see, that's a significant financial benefits. Oh, and by the way, there's no operational impact. It doesn't affect your logistics or your supply chain. You can ship your goods out of your warehouse anytime, any day, using any mode of transportation, and meet that just-in-time concept, while saving a lot of money, while deferring your duty, while manufacturing your product, while exporting your goods. So you see, if you start to really look at all the different supply chain solutions you have in place and incorporate it into the Foreign Trade Zone, it's not just one benefit, but it's 5 benefits, or 10 benefits, depending on your business model. Some of the success stories here in Long Beach. This was actually, they're actually in Moreno Valley right now, which is Skechers. Skechers saves over $1 million a year just on the weekly entry program. They do all the other things too, but they're saving over $1 million a year. The other one is a company down in San Diego that's an electronics company, and they save over $2 million a year on the weekly entry. Okay. One correction I do want to make is that the merchandise processing fee about 3 months ago is still 0.3464%, but the cap has gone up to $508. I haven't updated that on my slide yet. I'm in the process of doing that. So that cap is $508 in case anyone wants to fact check me. So what are some of the other benefits to look at as well? There's significant flexibility in a Foreign Trade Zone. Everything is automated in a Foreign Trade Zone. There's minimal documentation in your day-to-day activities with the Foreign Trade Zone. If you bring in high volume goods on a daily basis, instead of filing one form with customs per shipment, I can file a daily form. So I can bring in 100 containers and file one form versus filing 100 forms. There is no bond requirement as an importer until it leaves the warehouse and enters the commerce. Security requirements. There's high security requirements in customs eyes. What does high security mean? High security means you lock your doors, you have an alarm system, and you have cameras. I bet you all of us have those 3 things already. That is the minimum requirement to meet the security requirements for U.S. Customs. So that is not significant by any means. A lot of companies will avoid or avoid quota requirements by bringing goods into a foreign trade zone. So they'll bring things like sugar will come into a foreign trade zone until the quota opens back up. So companies will do that to benefit with the quota. One of the things I mentioned earlier was drawback. In case you don't know what drawback is the refund process by U.S. Customs to refund you your duty if you exported something. So without the foreign trade zone, I import something, I clear customs, I pay my duties. Then I decide I'm going to export the goods. Once I export them, I then file an entry with U.S. Customs asking for a refund of my duties. 3 months later, Customs sends you 99% of your duties back. In a foreign trade zone, that entire process gets eliminated because you never paid customs on the front end. But in some cases, companies may have product they already did clear customs on, and now they want to export it. So what's the process there? Well, the benefit is I can put it into my foreign trade zone, I can assign it to be exported only, and I can file my drawback while it's sitting in your warehouse, and I get a refund on my duties while it's still sitting in your warehouse. So again, more benefits that the program offers. Indefinite storage. You can have goods in your foreign trade zone for as long as you want. Because it's outside the commerce of the U.S., there is no limitation to how long it sits there. So there's some companies that have product that sits for 30 years. Why would anyone want to have it sit for 30 years? That's a good question, but there are some industries where commodities are sold on London Metal Exchange or COMEX. So it's sold as a commodity while it's sitting in a foreign trade zone. So it may get traded on a daily basis, but the product actually never leaves. And so it's able to be in a foreign trade zone. Where you can't have it, you can't do that in any other environment but a foreign trade zone. You can also exhibit, repair and analysis for the temporary removal like we talked about. And that's basically it. So I know that's a lot of information. Hopefully it's gotten you excited. I know I could talk another 8 hours, but it's a great program for companies that are importing something, whether it's a raw material component, and then whatever you do with that product, the foreign trade zone can create a benefit for you.